Here are the last 6 books I read in the last 3 months. Now before I talk about any of these, I get this question all the time, how much do I read and so on and so forth. As you can see, 6 books is just going to be 2 books a month.
Where did you learn to count?
They're kind of big books in my defense, but I don't read like 25 books a month. I have a lot of books, but like I'm not someone who does this. I read 25 books in April. Here's the 37 books I read in 2 months. Here's the 500 books I read in 1 year.
Here in my garage.
I can't read that much. I don't want to read that much. And I only read 2 hours a day to begin with. So as much as I love books, I do more than just read. The first book is The New Case for Gold. So I said that this book is basically the old case for gold. That is still true, but there's some new stuff in here. The book is going to go over like all the old generic arguments for gold. So for example, he talks about how gold is a store of value, and that when the US dollar goes up against the value of gold, it's in fact because the US dollar is going down. So for example, if one, let's say, unit of gold costs $100 and then 2 months later it costs $200, that's because the US dollar is losing its value.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
And you still have the same amount of gold, right? So gold is a store of value. He teaches you about that. Some of the new stuff that I would argue that's in here is how financial institutions have stayed on a gold standard. He calls it the shadow standard. So for example, China.
China. I have to have my China. China because China
Is buying a lot of gold from companies all over the place. And what has happened is he's talked to these companies and he found that these companies are like back ordered 6 months. So they have 6 months of orders due, and almost 80% of those orders are going to China.
It comes from China.
The US Federal Reserve basically had this issue where their securities, when he ran the calculations for the interest rates, made them insolvent. But when he talked to someone who worked at the Federal Reserve about this, the guy basically said, we just didn't do an inventory check on our gold, we didn't update the price of our gold, but we have like $66 billion in gold here. So gold stopped them from being insolvent. And he said that in the future, what you're going to see is countries with the biggest amount of gold to fiat currency ratio will determine any kind of new financial system that comes into place. And so that's why they're all buying up gold. Russia, China, America, Germany, they're all buying up gold, and they're all taking their gold back to their own vaults and banks, whereas beforehand they used to store them in like Swiss banks or something like this, or more internationally trusted institutions. That's not the case anymore. So that's one new thing I learned from this book. The rest of it is kind of like the old case for gold, like gold's good against inflation and stuff like this. It was a fun book. I would recommend people read it, and I would say it's gonna get a 5-star for me.
It's not a liquid!
Demons by Dostoevsky. This is the first fiction book I've read probably in like 3 years. Probably. Maybe longer. Most likely longer. I love nonfiction, so I'm glad I actually got into this, because this is like a good fiction book that like persuades me to go into fiction more. And I did. I got the next book I'm going to read is The Idiot. I bought that one. This is a great book, to be honest. Like definitely top 10 books I've ever read. The book is this idea, like it's called the demons, and the idea behind the book is that there are like ideas or values from either the West, so like America or Germany, and Russia, that come to like possess people's minds. I think people always talk about like this translation is supposed to mean like the possessed, but when he says demons, he just means like, yeah, these ideas that possess people's minds. And he goes over the different isms that he thinks are very prominent as they're appearing in Russia.
Not Vladimir Putin.
So he thinks, for example, liberalism has come to Russia. He thinks capitalism, egoism, hedonism. These isms that he takes to be as bad have come to Russia, and he communicates the bad features of these isms through characters. So for example, there's this one character named Krylov in this book who thinks that the ultimate act of, like, if you're truly having a free will, I don't want to spoil anything, but like if you truly have if you have a free will, then you have to be able to kill yourself, because that is like the truest expression of the will. And this character is very like nihilistic, right? And that's one example of like an ism communicated in this book. He also says that there's a clash between like this Russian-born spiritualism and naturalism, or no, this Russian-born spiritualism and nationalism that collides with liberalism all the time, and you can see this in some of the characters. They kind of butt heads.
I think you've had enough. No? Now you've had enough. Bitch.
Because one has this Russian-born nationalism that he doesn't like, and the other has like this Western liberalism that he doesn't like. He's basically like taking the piss. He's making fun of both of them, both these Western isms and these Russian-born isms. Great book, and the story is also very, very fun to read. Another book I read was The Quotable Jung by Joseph Campbell. I would say if you're gonna read any Jung, start with Man and His Symbols. This book was literally designed to be an introduction to Jungian psychology. I wish you would have read that first. I didn't know that, because I'm dumb. But this book is also like kind of an overview. So if Man and His Symbols is an introduction, this is an overview. This book is basically a collection of essays and just snippets from different books put together by Joseph Campbell. He puts it in one book, and it'll give you a kind of a general understanding of Jungian psychology. If you're gonna read all of Jung's books like I am, then you don't really need this book. But if you just want to understand Jung in like the basic sense, basic framework, get some general ideas of his, this is a great book to get. Jung is a fantastic writer. You might not agree with all of his ideas, but his writing style is very delicious. It's very enjoyable. It's like a fine cuisine. I wish more people wrote like Jung. However, his ideas are a bit strange, so if you can't get into strange ideas, don't bother with Jung. Great book nonetheless. The Ripple Effect. This book, whenever I talk about it, people just seem not to care. But it's an important book. Now, I want to say it's The Ripple Effect, The Fate of Fresh Water in the 21st Century. This book is literally just about American water while talking about some international issues. It's like 80% American water, 20% international issues. It also talks about not just the fate of fresh water, but also like water quality, droughts, kind of goes into like a little bit of climate change, city planning as it relates to water. The book title doesn't do a good job at explaining what the book is about. But with that being said, I think it's very important to maybe not read this book, because to be honest, this book is very into bashing companies, and it doesn't provide graphs. So it talks about, for example, how something like 50% of America's lakes and rivers, so like 50% of America's lakes are like unswimmable, and like 60% of the rivers are like polluted beyond repair, something like this. Right? I forget the statistic. Don't worry about that. But it didn't show by like by time. It just showed the statistic. So like it's this percentage of lakes and rivers, but it didn't show by time. And so I want to know, well, is it that in say 2015 the percentage annually has gone down, that this all happened in 1 year? There's not enough time series data in here, and so it kind of biases my understanding. And on top of that, he only attacks companies. The only company he didn't really attack too hard was Intel, because they have a really sustainable way of manufacturing chips. But other than that, every other company he bashed, he didn't talk about any of their practices. I know, for example, ExxonMobil has changed a lot of the ways they do things because of the bad PR that they were getting. They still have a long way to go. I agree, the big companies have a long way to go, but like I want to give credit where credit is due. So this book is a bit biased and doesn't have the right kind of data that you're looking for. The issue, however, The Fate of Fresh Water, is extremely important. That's something we need to talk about, and people don't want to seem to talk about it, or maybe it's just this book. Get a different book on water. This book is like a 3 out of 5 stars. Manufacturing, Consent, Political Economy of Mass Media by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. I always hear people talk about this and say it's a Noam Chomsky book. There's 2 authors to this book. So I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. So it is a good book, okay? The ideas in here are terrific. I also love the explorations and applications of some of the ideas in this book. So for example, the idea behind the book, let me explain this. The idea behind the book is that you can manufacture consent. This is how the West, this is how America does their mass media. And the way they do this is by covering events that favor their narrative and ignoring ones that don't. It's not that they make up truths, it's that they selectively cover truths. This is what he means by manufacturing consent. And he basically talks about, for example, in Nicaragua, how America blamed the extreme political left and the extreme political right for, let's say, unjustified killings or corruption and so on and so forth, when in reality it was the American-backed government in Nicaragua that was doing these things. It wasn't the political left or the political right. But American media was really good at covering things that the political left or political right were doing wrong, and good at ignoring the things that their supported candidate was doing wrong, right? That's what manufacturing consent is about. He also explains in the beginning how this manufacturing consent model came about through, you can see big wealthy families buying up newspapers and media outlets and basically monopolizing these things, basically solidifying their control over it. This is how it came about. This is all great, fine, dandy, delicious, great ideas. I love it. However, the book repeats itself a lot. And this is why I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. It repeats itself quite a bit. Again, I do appreciate exploring real world examples, but I feel like at some point these authors just cared more about like analyzing American foreign policy than actually explaining manufacturing consent. So that's why I gave it 4 to 5 stars. I still recommend you read it. It's still a great book, and I don't want to like bash it too much. Manufacturing consent. Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. This book has, like, it gets a lot of support, but also a lot of people hate the New Optimist. So like Pinker would be like one of these New Optimists, and this book predates his Enlightenment Now book. His Enlightenment Now book is straight up just New Optimism and like why the world is getting better. This book is about why crime is declining, and there are some issues with the book, right? There's obviously some issues with the evidence, but even when you look at the issues that are taken with the evidence, and you take a more conservative approach towards the evidence, I would still think Pinker's arguments in this book are great. He talks about, for example, how the Leviathan theory holds true, that with the increase in centralized state authority, there's a decrease in crime. He talks about how cooperation between nations has led to less conflicts. So, like, for example, countries that have more intergovernmental organizations, like let's say it's oil companies or something, tend to resolve their conflicts more peacefully. He even talks about how some of the Enlightenment values can be linked to what he called like a civilizing process, which he got from like another author called the civilization process. And overall, it's like basically a book that talks about how humans still have a lot of bad things in their natures, but through financial institutions, legal institutions, political organizations, and so on and so forth, we can kind of rein in our nature and make it a little bit better. He does try to make it clear that this progress is not guaranteed. I think that's a really important point, that progress has to be continually done. So just because like we have good things now doesn't mean that they're going to stay. They're only going to stay here if we continue to work towards that. And he also even argues that like beforehand we were more violent, right? That the number of deaths per war and so on and so forth were higher. The book has a lot of interesting, well-researched arguments, and I'd be careful when you read the critiques of Steven Pinker's works, because a lot of people don't realize that Steven Pinker takes like a very robotic approach almost to writing. I would say if there's like one true empiricist with writing, he's like a really idealized way of being an empiricist in your writing. And he takes one claim, let's say for example that humans were more violent beforehand and they're more peaceful now. And he'll then support like this claim with like 15 or 20 premises to support the main argument. And then people will critique him by refuting one premise. So for example, in the claim that societies were more violent beforehand, like hunter-gatherers were more violent, he presents a graph that's based off of like archaeological evidence through finding skeletons. And people have tried to argue that his interpretation of this data is questionable. But that's literally like one argument or one premise that he uses to support the claim out of like 15. Because right after the skeleton argument, he goes into like actual qualitative research and looks at the writings given to us by like hunter-gatherers, and they were violent. They encouraged violence, right? But nobody actually critiques that data. They only critique one piece of the data and then say that all of Pinker's arguments are refuted. To be fair, no one's going to read like a 250,000 word book and go for every premise. And so I can get why people just choose to be lazy about critiquing his book. But if you really want to understand Pinker, I would suggest you actually read his book, maybe highlight the arguments if you really want to like debunk him. Point being is it's a great book, has a lot of critics. Read it and think of it what you will. Just be careful to not like refute the entire book because you heard one good counter argument. Usually he has more than one argument to support his points. But anyways, those are the last 6 books I've read. I hope you found some that you liked. I think all of them were actually pretty good. There was only, like, again, the Chomsky book and the Water book. So Chomsky book repeats itself. The Water book is misleading and doesn't have, like, sufficient data to persuade me on some of its points, and it's obviously a little bit biased. But other than that, those are all great books, and if you want to read any of them, just let me know below if you want to know anything more about those books. I'm totally willing to discuss them with you. I love discussing books. And with that being said, hadi bye bye.